Right now, on a remote island floating just off the coast of Siberia, deep inside the Arctic Circle, a thermometer recorded a temperature that has never been documented this far north anywhere on the entire planet. On June 25th of this year, Beliy Island, sitting at 73.3 degrees north latitude off Russia's Yamal Peninsula, reached 28.3 degrees Celsius, 83 degrees Fahrenheit, a reading that climate researchers, tracking extreme temperature records worldwide, say is apparently the highest temperature ever recorded this far north anywhere in the world. This single extraordinary day was not an isolated fluke. It arrived as part of what has now been confirmed as the Arctic's warmest June ever measured, 2.22 degrees Celsius above average, breaking the previous record set back in 2012 by more than a quarter of a degree. Today we are going to break down exactly what happened on that single record day, why it occurred alongside a completely separate heat wave scorching Europe at the same time, and what the actual consequences of an Arctic running this hot mean for the rest of the planet. No exaggeration, no doomsday guessing, just the data, the science, and the real stakes. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever thought about what temperature actually feels like inside the Arctic Circle? Or been surprised by how warm these remote regions can get? Tell me what you thought. So many of you have seen headlines about Arctic warming, and I always want to hear what genuinely surprised you. If you want to know the moment new Arctic climate data comes out, subscribe right now, it costs nothing, and a thumbs up tells the algorithm to put this in front of people who genuinely want the real science. Let us get into it. Beliy Island is a genuinely remote, largely uninhabited stretch of tundra sitting just off the northern tip of the Yamal Peninsula in Russia's Arctic North, a place whose entire climate identity has always been defined by cold, not heat, surrounded by sea ice for much of the year and rarely mentioned in any conversation about extreme temperatures. That is precisely why a reading of 28.3 degrees Celsius there was so immediately notable to climate researchers. This is not a location anyone expected to challenge global records for how far north extreme heat could physically reach. According to tracking from researchers who monitor extreme temperature records worldwide, this appears to be the highest temperature ever documented this far north on the planet, a distinction based specifically on the combination of the reading's intensity and the island's extreme latitude, rather than being simply the highest number recorded in the Arctic overall. What makes this event scientifically fascinating, rather than simply a strange outlier, is what else was happening across the globe at the exact same moment. This extreme Siberian heat occurred concurrently with the historic late June heat wave scorching Western and Central Europe, the same event that broke national temperature records across France, Germany, and Spain, and pushed Fabra Observatory in Barcelona to its highest reading in more than a century of continuous data. But climate researchers tracking both events were explicit that these were not the same weather system reaching across the continent. They were entirely distinct atmospheric events happening in different regions simultaneously, since Russia east of the Ural Mountains was actually running cooler than normal during this exact same window. This detail matters enormously for how scientists interpret what is happening to global weather patterns. Two separate extreme heat events erupting in different regions during the same week is a very different phenomenon from one single system stretching to cover both. And it points toward a broader atmospheric circulation pattern capable of generating multiple, independent pockets of record-breaking heat scattered thousands of kilometers apart rather than one simple, connected heat dome. The Beliy Island reading fit into a broader pattern of extraordinary warmth across specific pockets of the Arctic throughout June, with the most dramatic warmth concentrated in western Siberia specifically. Russia's Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, the administrative region containing Beliy Island, experienced by far its warmest June on record according to detailed climate reanalysis data. Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago deep in the European Arctic, recorded its warmest June on record for the third time in just the past 5 years, a repetition that itself tells researchers something important. This is not a single anomalous spike, but part of an accelerating pattern concentrated specifically in the Atlantic-facing side of the Arctic. Parts of Canada's Northwest Territories and southern Nunavut also recorded their warmest Junes on record during this same period. Climate researchers analyzing the full picture found that roughly 70% of the entire Arctic, counting both land and sea areas north of 60 degrees latitude, experienced a warmer than average June compared to the 1991 through 2020 baseline, and remarkably, almost 85% of Arctic land areas specifically ran milder than normal, with about 12% of the entire Arctic region experiencing its warmest June since 1950 based on detailed atmospheric reanalysis modeling. Only about 1% of the Arctic recorded its coldest June in the past 77 years, meaning the warmth documented this June was not a narrow, localized event. It was a dominant pattern covering the overwhelming majority of the entire polar region at once. Now here is where the shocking part of this story becomes measurable rather than simply dramatic. According to the National Snow and Ice Data Center, Arctic sea ice extent during June 2026 registered as the third lowest in the entire 48-year satellite record, trailing behind only 2016 and 2025. And moving into July, Arctic sea ice extent was tracking even slightly below the pace set in 2012, the year that went on to establish the all-time record for lowest seasonal sea ice extent ever measured in September. This is precisely the mechanism that turns a single record hot day into a consequence that compounds across the following months. Sea ice functions as a reflective shield. Its bright white surface bounces the majority of incoming solar radiation back into space rather than allowing the ocean beneath to absorb it. When record heat events accelerate, ice melt earlier and more extensively than usual, more open, dark ocean water becomes exposed to direct sunlight, and that darker water absorbs dramatically more solar energy than reflective ice ever would, warming the water further and making it even harder for ice to reform as autumn approaches. A self-reinforcing cycle scientists call the ice albedo feedback. This is exactly why researchers pay such close attention to remote, single-day extreme events like the Beliy Island reading. Even though it lasted only one day in one remote location, days this hot occurring this far north actively contribute real physical heat energy into a regional system that determines how much sea ice survives through an entire melting season, feeding directly into whether this year ultimately challenges the all-time low sea ice records currently held by 2012 and 2025. This connects to a broader global pattern that has made 2026 one of the warmest years scientists have ever measured. For the first half of this year, the global average temperature ran 1.47 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline, ranking as the third warmest such period ever recorded. And researchers specifically noted that the strongest warming signal across the entire 12-month running average continues to concentrate across the Arctic, in the northern high latitudes of Canada, Russia, and Siberia, with no regions anywhere on the planet showing significant relative cooling over that same period. This is the scientific answer to why a single remote Arctic heat record matters so much more than its brief, one-day duration might suggest. It is not an isolated curiosity. It is one visible data point inside a much larger, sustained pattern of the Arctic warming considerably faster than the global average, a phenomenon researchers have documented for years and refer to as Arctic amplification. If you are following this story because you live far from the Arctic yourself, the practical relevance is genuinely global rather than regional. Accelerated Arctic sea ice loss and permafrost thaw feed directly into rising global sea levels and shifting weather patterns across the mid-latitudes, since researchers have increasingly connected a warming, less predictable Arctic to changes in how the jet stream behaves further south, the exact same jet stream disruption mechanism behind the blocking heat domes that have repeatedly parked over Europe and North America this year. If you are simply following Arctic climate news out of genuine curiosity, understanding events like the Beliy Island record gives you a far more accurate picture than assuming the Arctic is uniformly frozen and stable year-round, since the region's most extreme changes are increasingly concentrated in specific hotspots like western Siberia and Svalbard, rather than spread more evenly across the entire polar circle. Final thought. A single day of 28.3 degrees Celsius on a remote island most people have never heard of might sound like a strange, disconnected headline, but the actual data tells a far more coherent story. This was one visible spike inside the Arctic's warmest June ever recorded, occurring during a year already tracking as one of the warmest half years in the entire historical record, arriving alongside sea ice extent running at levels that could genuinely threaten existing record lows before this year's melting season even ends. The shocking part of this story is not really the number on the thermometer itself, it is what that number represents. A polar region that scientists have spent decades warning would warm faster than anywhere else on Earth, now delivering exactly the kind of extreme. Record-breaking data points that confirm those warnings were not exaggerated. We will keep tracking every new Arctic temperature record, every sea ice extent update, and every seasonal climate summary as this year continues to unfold. Subscribe so you do not miss it, and leave that comment below. Did the idea of an Arctic island reaching 83 degrees Fahrenheit genuinely surprise you? Because understanding what is actually happening at the top of the world is how the rest of us stay informed about a system that affects weather patterns everywhere on the planet. Let us get this one to 5,000 likes. See you in the next one.